Every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. W. Edwards Deming. If that's true, and it usually is, then what we're seeing from technology today isn't accidental. It's not a bug, and it's not a momentary lapse in judgment. It's the output of systems optimized for speed, scale, and profit, while responsibility, accountability, and public trust lag far behind. Technology companies now operate as economic engines, civic spaces, and geopolitical actors all at once, shaping markets, speech, security, and even conflict. Yet, they often do so without the obligations that traditionally accompany that level of power. Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you a competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in technology, intelligence, and it's February 2nd, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
Good morning, Eric. I'm both maddened and astounded that my hair's out of control. So,
Oh, it looks good.
yeah, that's what I noticed when I look at it this morning. It's wow and wow.
Yeah, got to deal with the bedhead these days.
Yeah, totally. Anyway, how about you? What's on your mind?
Well, we got Super Bowl week coming up. Wanted to get your picks.
To use your line that just delighted me from a few weeks ago, I did not have Patriots versus Seahawks on my bingo card.
No.
I'm going to go with the Seahawks because I hate the Patriots, although I will say what's cool about the Patriots is they seem to be like a Pope Heel pocket fisherman. There's just a lot of things they can do. They can play the game in a lot of ways. They've got versatility at lots of positions, so they're a fun team to watch. But I'm going to go with Seattle and Sam Darnold. I just think it's a Cinderella story that's ready to be finished up. How about you?
Yeah, I think it's cool both teams being in. The past couple of years, they've had pretty down seasons. There's a new turnaround for Mike Vrabel coming home to the Patriots. Same thing with the Seahawks. A new coach started 2 years ago, and interesting organizational management and cultural turnarounds on both those organizations. I'm going to go with Seahawks as well. I think they're going to win. So what's going on with you?
I was just thinking real quick to do a quick mini romp. We've had 3 episodes this year where we've talked about precedent and signals in kind of geopolitics and elections, trust. And so just a really quick, walk around to the places we've discussed before and say, which way is it going? I think Minnesota is interesting because you're getting a change in rhetoric a bit from the government, something that we advocated for, which is, come on, show some leadership here. That situation cannot continue as it is.
Yep.
I think it remains to be seen whether the rhetoric translates into action. There's a lot of whipsawing still going on that one.
Sure.
And to us, that was something that we said needed to happen. I will also say we talked about government needing to explain before it acts in order to ensure trust. And I'm not sure that the Don Lemon arrest was a great example of explaining first or just going with the headline. So I'm going to give it a pick 'em on that one, but it's better than it could have been. Seizing the election data from Georgia is a negative signal on where we're going with elections and how hard having some sort of kind of baseline system in which we can trust is going to be to establish in this. This is one version of it. I think this will turn out to be more noise than signal, but it certainly is a trend line. What will happen with this one is that the courts will get into the play and they will find, was there enough precedent for it? Has statute of limitations? So it'll be fought out, and it still is looking in the rearview mirror. But the courts can't be the bulwark when it comes to elections because they take a long time. So if we get into the next one, we're still doing this kind of stuff. It'll be tough. Budget agreement over DHS. They did a little bit what we said, trying to hive it off so you didn't have massive shutdown. They did it too late to avoid some. It was sounding good on Friday. It's sounding less good this morning. It's interesting that we're seeing some backlash from ICE deployment at international events, which to tie that with Davos, you're seeing more nations standing up to what the U.S. wants to do and saying, not here. And then Greenland is interesting because on the one hand, I think There are more security discussions going on. That's good. And there are still protests all over free Greenland. So I don't know. I think we're seeing action on all the fronts, and I hope what we've given listeners a chance to do is to look at what's happening against the framework that we laid out and see what they think in terms of the trend, and so that they can plan their actions.
Yeah, but the ICE deployments overseas, that's a bit of a framing thing. These aren't ICE officers going to immigration crackdowns. These are individuals assigned to ICE administratively who are going operationally controlled to supplement operations overseas for security and things around the Olympics.
Totally, but now let's assert that that is true, exactly as you framed it. But now we're in a world where you have the world energized to want to prove its sovereignty. So that has always been the case. There's always been negotiations over how many people can come in a country
Right.
from another one. I mean, this
Yeah.
this is ever thus, but I think you're seeing this now energy around kind of public opinion and national action that is now playing out very publicly. I think there's a real question of whether any government right now is particularly well suited to deal with the will of the people when that will gets energized. It is a different version of the volumetric effect of AI that we're going to talk about now, and governments are showing. So
Yeah.
I think you're 100% right, but I don't think that stops it from being something that people want to highlight for whatever agenda they're pursuing,
Yeah.
and willingness to do so on an international stage.
Well, what are we going to talk about today?
So today, I think what we're going to do is talk about technology as power, not just product, and what happens when there's responsibility without clear lines of accountability, and stakeholders go far beyond shareholders. A little bit to Deming's quotation about, don't look now,
Mhm.
but we actually have a system where, at least here, competitive forces and the speed at which they can act are driving our system to move to that's where the decisions are being made for good, better, and different, at the expense of some of the things that governmental democratic decision making has generally put in place. So we're going to try and talk on technology, some of the signals when it comes to just the capabilities itself, the responsibility of the leaders of those companies, and how it's playing out globally in terms of power.
And it's not all doom and gloom. We've got a few rays of sunshine, I think. I hope.
More than not doom and gloom is there's nothing wrong. I love free market. I love capitalism. You wonder why China comes here to steal intellectual property is because this amazing engine we have that produces new and just vibrance is amazing. So not only not gloom and doom, but it does tons of good things for us. And if you went the other direction and you had government whose only tool is regulation is the thing that's trying to rein it all in, you have what people have complained about in the past is you don't get that sort of thing. So don't think gloom and doom. Think action consequence. Is that what we want?
All right, let's get to it. So we'll start with the impact of AI, unconstrained and as an instrument of power. The Anthropic CEO recently voiced some of his fears in an essay he wrote titled The Adolescence of Technology. He warned that we're entering the most dangerous window in AI history, a moment that could test who we are as a species as powerful capabilities arrive faster than our institutions can adapt. Things that have compressed some of these safety timelines are AI becoming autonomous, bad actors using AI to create bioweapons and other nefarious activities, and then endogenous acceleration, AI designing its own successors. But he starts his essay with a reference to Carl Sagan's book Contact, which was later a movie with Jodie Foster, where the main character, an astronomer who has detected the first radio signals from an alien civilization, is being considered for the role of humanity's representative to meet the aliens. This international panel interviewing her asked, if you could ask the aliens just one question, what would it be? And her reply was, I'd ask them, how did you do it? How did you evolve? How did you survive this technological adolescence without destroying yourself? And the essay that he wrote is supposed to be a wake-up call and a call for action on AI safety. But Sue, I wanted to get your idea and focus on this moment of, quote, adolescence. Powerful, but not yet mature.
I'm a big fan of every time the next generation comes into the workforce. And there's kind of a built-in organizational stodginess of these young whippersnappers, these Gen Zers or millennials before them or somebody else, they just don't know how it's done. And I have a very different view, and that is every generation that comes in is smarter than the one before. And the organization's responsibility is not to constrain them, but to figure out how to make them the most effective to achieve the outcomes we want. In other words, don't resist new coming into your organization. Rather, as leaders of the organization, say, how are we going to use that to good effect? So number one is I get it's really easy to mock adolescence. One of the things you have to do is you just have to look at it and say, well, it is going to get older and it is going to be here and it is going to be what drives us. So do some good work. The second thing is, for as smart as I say they are not wise yet, right? And wisdom is really about decisions made and then second and third order effects being revealed. So to Jodie Foster's question, how'd you do it? I would ask instead, while you were doing it, what did you miss? What unintended consequence was spurred? What surprised you, both positively and negatively along the way? Because we are most assuredly going to be on this journey. You and I have talked about this before. There's no putting this genie back in the bottle. There's no longing for a simpler time. It is here. The world moves this fast. The democratization, funny to use that word as we also talk about capitalism, the democratization of data has just changed so much and made things so available. And then our little engine has just promulgated it. So I think the thing that we need to somehow do is to increase the opportunity for us to understand second and third order effects of the decisions that we're making today, regardless of where they're being made. The second thing is, and this is just something that continuously worries me, and that is who bears the weight of the decision? And by that, I mean, who has responsibility for what happens? And it is really different in companies than in governments. One of the problems we have is that all those decisions are being made so fast, it's hard for humans to get in the loop. And we talked about this before, about the myth of human on the loop. When you're talking about machine speeds,
Hmm.
you could just take a different word, the slowness of governments when contrasted with the speed of this. So the consequences of a system that no longer has the risk governor on it, and/or that expects the private sector to account for all the risks when their incentives are very different from governmental decisions. So I don't know. I think it's a fascinating inflection moment. And I think the question is good. I like the essay. Well, I also like Anthropic as a company, but I think it supposes that we can long for a simpler time. It's doing a great job of problem identifying, not much problem solving. I don't know how much it helps, but I thought it was a fine reflection of the concerns that are there.
Yeah, I think the adolescence is interesting from the perspective of we were all at one time a teenager. We remember that, or maybe we have teenagers or have interacted with them, and impulsive, right? It comes to mind, not fully developed, brain still forming, your point about wisdom. But the glass half full side of that is they're still impressionable, right? So we are going to see this acceleration. We are going to see things that we're not ready for, things that surprise us, but we're still in a way where we can shape it instead of just so stuck in its ways and established that it's so hard to change.
To talk about it globally, in this technology power might game, the US is super established, super wise, super good. The adolescents of the world, the countries that never tried to do this stuff of power projection before, are actually able to move faster. They have new ideas and they can implement them. And so again, it's more like thinking about how we get the outcome we want rather than saying, I don't like new because it doesn't fit into my modality.
Yeah.
Because our modality, and you can just see this internationally, because of our installed base in the US, our adjustment to modern warfare is slower than Ukraine's.
Hmm.
Even though they rely on us for weapons and a whole bunch of other stuff, man, their ability to manipulate how they deal with modern warfare is different. Even the Houthis and their drones. So adolescence can't be repressed because what it brings with it is new. But it also isn't wise. So gotta have that tension. We talk about it all the time.
Yeah, so some other guys who put out problems and didn't really offer any solutions were your friends over at the Atlantic Council. They put together a report called 8 Ways AI Will Shape Geopolitics in 2026. And I just want to highlight one here that stood out as kind of interesting to me. Russia's Pravda network is flooding the internet with millions of propaganda articles aimed less at human readers and more at AI training pipelines. Content designed to be scraped by web crawlers and absorbed into model training data. The excerpt argues this is already working. Researchers have shown Pravda content surfacing indirectly through places like Wikipedia and X Community and appearing in major chatbot responses. And other research suggests even small amounts of bad data can, quote, poison very large models. The article predicts AI poisoning will go mainstream in 2026 because of this lag in training data. So, like I said, Sue, they didn't offer suggestion, only alarm. But do you have a suggestion on what we should do or how we should think about this?
So I'm gonna add my alarm to their alarm.
Just pile on.
And a little bit. So this is not unique, but it is made more problematic by just technology and volume. And
Mhm.
that is you have Elon Musk owning X, Mark Zuckerberg with Meta, CBS's new CEO of news is Barry Weiss. All these people have made it clear that they have a particular viewpoint that they believe is valid. They're tied to the Trump administration that's in power.
Yeah.
And they are, for exactly the reasons the Atlanta Council says, they're curating it. And the problem is not that we haven't always had curated news. For goodness sakes, Walter Cronkite, someone was deciding what they were going to put on the news. The problem is it's just so fast and it's so much. And it hits up against humans that don't have the tools other than to try to deal with each piece of information as though it's valuable as any piece of information. And so whatever news they get, whatever source they get, whatever is the majority of what they get is what they tend to believe. And so that has some really difficult shaping effects. So I think the Atlanta Council is right about the problem. I think we have it going on here. And again, I'm agnostic over who has that governor. I don't like the communications being exclusively tied to a particular view of the world because of the volume and speed of what can be shoved out
Mhm.
and the difficulty humans have of sorting through it. So here's my solution. One, I think lies spread faster than the truth. The truth gets acted upon by humans and it gets changed by their truth and it moves along. And so I think we still need to work on tools that help us understand the provenance of the information that's being shared to us. And by that I mean any individual should have any opinion you want. I love free speech. I love you thinking what you want to think and me thinking what I think, and then we go tussling at it. What I don't like is when there is some anonymized production of a single view that just can instantaneously flow out to the environment. So I think we need to work on provenance a bit. And I think time could be an interesting discriminator or tool in understanding how information spreads and using that as an indicator of what its provenance likely is, giving humans better tools to not have to try and pick and choose whether it comports with their worldview or whether it's received on their favorite platform, but rather how they can understand what the provenance of that information was. So,
Yeah, and times are probably a good way to identify whether it's poison or whether
right.
it's, how much. And as we continue on this volumetric effect.
One of the things that was an attempt to try and do something about what the government perceived was the spread of information was during the first Trump administration, where the government couldn't figure out how to help citizens adjudicate between what was true and what was not. And so they turned to the companies to say, hey, you got the responsibility. And almost immediately it was recognized that that was a slippery slope, right? Because what they turned to was content adjudication, and it was really difficult. So this is where we need to figure out how we have some way of helping individuals get back in the process of their own cognition, not just manufactured cognition that is algorithmically derived.
Yeah, it's tough when you live your life one scroll at a time, right? 96 at a time. And the way our brains evolved and developed, we see things. We take it in and our brain sees it that is present and that is actual. If it's persistent, then that's how we reacted to it as we, whether it was a saber-toothed tiger or some other threat, how we behaved is primarily through our other senses.
Yeah, I'm part of some other discussions. This is apropos of nothing except what you just said about vision is one of the surrogates for human cognition at machine speeds, the insertion of geospatial data into some of these decision chains. In other words, if you could have an image at speed, if you could have location at speed, if you could have time at speed, would that help insert what is essentially a human adjudicator of whether it's believable or not? So I think there needs to be just a number of things that happen that don't just say, I'm going to put a human in the loop, because I just don't think it works time-wise. But there is lots of science that said that human processing of data has massively more fidelity than we have yet been able to generate in machines. And so how do we put those two things together?
Yeah. Well, I think just maintaining human relationships part of it too, and
Yeah.
having
Yeah.
actual discussions
Yeah.
with other human beings. Because if you're just getting your content and information one-sided or tailored to you, then you miss out on those opportunities for critical thinking and debate.
Yeah, and we're talking about AI, but I mean, just in general, I just like to remind people technology itself doesn't have a soul. It's doing a thing that ultimately it does come down to humans use it. So even when we're talking about AI, this tension between who's helping manage the risk of it, you're talking about which human risk model, privatized or governmental,
Hmm.
is acting on it, which players are acting on it. Even when you hear the both sidism, which while they both do that, what people are fundamentally saying is what gives it disproportionate power is when you only get one human viewpoint at it, not just a machine viewpoint. So, yeah, I don't think we can escape the role of the human and the human judgment. The question is how to get the clock speeds matched up.
One of the other things to look out for in terms of this infrastructure is where we get our information from and the pipelines that we use to access this information. But the IPPR, or Institute for Public Policy Research, did a report on ChatGPT's source bias. So they're a
Yeah.
British research charity. And I've talked before about how we need to train AI on the whole of the human experience, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly. But this research found that ChatGPT cited The Guardian news source 58% of the time in responses, while the BBC showed up 0%. Not as a quality judgment, but largely because licensing deals and publisher blocking that create opaque access rules. ChatGPT's top source was The Guardian, followed by Reuters, The Independent, and then The Financial Times. Compare that with Google AI, whose overview used the BBC as a source to its answers 52% of the time on their news queries, and then Perplexity used BBC about 36%. This will only get murkier as LLM starts to incorporate ads. In just this last month, saying OpenAI is testing and rolling out ads in ChatGPT for certain tiers, signaling a shift from this earlier no ads positioning. So when ChatGPT and other LLMs become how people understand the news, how we synthesize large groups of information and ask questions like you and I both do, and ChatGPT's sources are determined by licensing deals, haven't we just privatized epistemology? And before you answer, I just learned what that word means for this episode. Epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. So
I I
there you go.
I love that. I love that. I think I can be quick on this because it so ties to so many of the things we've said. I I I don't know, does your generation, Eric, know the term GIGO?
GIGO?
Yeah. Garbage in, garbage out.
Oh, yeah. Don't know we've abbreviated to GIGO.
Yeah, it's something we've always talked about is if you put bad data in, you're gonna get bad conclusions out, right?
Yeah.
That's just the way systems work. Be careful about the system that we produce because it will generate what we have. This is just a great example of it. And we kind of learned this lesson. I remember when Wikipedia first came out and the librarians were like, "Oh my gosh, horrors. How are you gonna have these people going to uncurated information?" Well, we found, in fact, that the more information you have, the closer you get to the truth, if in fact you get unconstrained access to all the information. So those two things, volume, amount, different perspective, lead to truth, but only if that's true, not I'm gonna selectively put things in. So
Statistics.
GIGO, remember that. I will say, just to be clear, don't think that this problem isn't prevalent inside governmental systems. And well, we call it access to classified information. I have seen bad decisions being made because some people had access to some information and not others that would change the outcome. And that's okay, I suppose, if it's purposeful, but if it's just de rigueur of where you happen to sit and it isn't tethered to the decisions you need to make, you can do that yourself. So again, this isn't a bashing the private sector or glorifying government. I'm just saying that this is a universal problem that you've described. And whether it is a paywall that keeps you from getting to the information or a choice of perspective that limits the amount of information, if you shape it going in, you cannot have confidence in what comes out.
Yep. Comes back to time. One of the opportunities for constraining or checking on this is policy. And we've talked about the US AI policy before a little bit in the infancy stages and still being evolved. The EU AI Act, stricter, but not enforced, and it's been delayed. They keep pushing it down the road. But recently, effective January 22nd, South Korea passed an AI Basic Act, or officially the Act on the Development of Artificial Intelligence and Establishment of Trust. The law establishes a national AI governance system to promote trusted, safe, and transparent AI development across sectors. Companies must label AI-generated content, including generative AI and deepfakes, so users know that it's synthetic. Firms must give advance notice when AI is used in products or services. Systems used in critical use cases like healthcare, hiring, loans, they require risk assessments, documentation, and human oversight. They also have moderate enforcement, so penalties exist. There's going to be fines up to about 30 million won. And contrasting that with the EU, they prioritize high risk mitigation of human rights, banning several high harm practices like social scoring and high penalties up to a percentage of global revenue if they're found in violation. But South Korea is encouraging more growth and competitiveness versus the EU's more regulatory kind of style. So do we like what they're leading with?
I do. It's an evolutionary version of it. Regulation is way too limited a tool to deal with this moment and to preserve the energy that leads to innovation that, when harnessed in a reasonable way, makes the world a better place.
Yeah.
When I look at it, we actually already have a model that we talk about before, kind of in the nuclear safety market, where it's kind of like radioisotopes. In other words, there are some things that are so persistent and so impactful that you want to use the model of looking at the risks in order to develop something that is secure. One of the things that I've said over and over again, and it isn't a one-for-one match, but it is a good model, is, boy, nuclear energy is certainly something that we did pretty well, where it was a great balance between a new explosive technology and management of risk. So what I like is that it's got life cycle governance, international regulations, safety critical risk assessments, and dual use regulation, and then incentives that are tied to either preserving or ensuring outcomes. I think it is a closer model to the kind of thing that can work, that does not take away the innovative capacity and does put some metrics for those creators, not just the people that are trying to govern it.
Yep. Yeah, I think having the watermark on there is critical.
Yep.
So our next bit, we'll talk about the power and responsibility of these tech companies and when infrastructure here is private. Tech companies have long been the governors of critical domains, information security, and war, but they don't have democratic mandates, consistent rules, or comparable accountability to government. In talks over a $200 million Pentagon contract, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and again Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei have a disagreement. The Pentagon wants maximum latitude to deploy commercial AI, while Anthropic wants enforceable limits on autonomous targeting and domestic surveillance. Hegseth has framed it bluntly. He doesn't want, quote, models that won't allow you to fight wars. Seems reasonable. Anthropic's position is we'll support national defense in all ways except those which would make us more like our autocratic adversaries. So, who should get to decide what's lawful versus what's ethical? The government, the company, or should we put together a Polymarket or Kalshi poll to figure this out?
Oh, huh, nice. You have so many good polls, Polymarket and Kalshi's polls.
Another way to bet on the Super Bowl?
Yeah.
And you're in Texas and won't let me get on FanDuel.
That's exactly right. Well, how do you think I made my prediction? Anyway, so what's so interesting about this kind of twist between Hegseth, who wants unconstrained ability to use technology
Yeah.
any way we want, and a company that wants constraints is fascinating because what's driving the company is what? The humans that work there,
Yeah.
the people who are saying, I don't want that. And so we're getting like this weird insertion of the will of the people now being executed through companies. And, I just think it's a really interesting piece of this equation is in constitutional republics and democracies, the will of the people matters. And is the will of the people an election, and then that set of people get to decide everything we do? But no, now you have the will of the people being affected through companies. And if you don't think companies are affecting what the government does, remember back when Google said it wouldn't sell products to the Defense Department because it was used for targeting? And again, that was myopic and silly on one level, but it is a will of the people. So government isn't good enough as a decision maker for a fast moving world if it only has two choices, which is to stop what is being developed or to say it can only be used for what I want because I won the election. Right? Neither of those is going to work. Tamir Pardo, head of the Mossad, once said, the problem with the world is a good decision today is a bad decision tomorrow, and it takes 2 weeks to make decisions. And that's kind of the problem with government right now. It just isn't able to fill its responsibility at the speed that decisions are being presented to it. And so it has to go with a model that is equally ineffective. It either stops or shapes decisions in a really interesting way. So that brings me back to your Kashi and Poly markets. Really interesting. These prediction markets are really great gut checks to compare against the judgment of traditional intelligence. They use lots of data. They have strengths, so there are lots of information aggregation, real-time data, incentivized accuracy, and broad utility. They can be, as you said, used to predicting geopolitics, to who you're going to bet on. And so there's this kind of wonderful volumetric effect that they have. The problem is that they're not a crystal ball, right? They've been proven to be about 70% effective. That leaves 30% what? I guess ineffective, or we don't know. Can a government ever allow 30% of the things that happen to be,
Yeah.
I don't know. They're susceptible to being manipulated. Again, we see what happens when data is selectively applied. The price isn't equal to truth. Back to those two different risk models, and the obverse is incentive models that the government and the industry has. And there is some regulatory scrutiny on them right now. So what I like about you bringing that forward is I don't think they're a replacement for the kind of risk equation that governments typically are trying to make, but governments that only rely on the tools they've had that are not using some of the value of massive amounts of data and some of the models that can bring information to light will also not be enough. And if the recent elections have been about anything, they've been about the American people, and I presume in other nations too, saying the government isn't good enough for what we need. And so I think there is, in your question, a great example of modern techniques that you can't just turn to, but you could learn to apply.
Using another OSINT tool, right? You have this available amount of data, and it's an indicator. We've used
Yep.
public polling for the longest time,
Yep.
for decades, and it's just another way to get more time sensitive, more timely data, and more timely impacts on some of that stuff. Just something to aid your decision making.
And there's so much data that says it's the quality of the prompt. Man, I love it. Not that I believe the answers that it gives me, but I can ask infinite questions and look at it a different way. And I get perspective that I can use. How do we shape that so it can be used as a tool of those who would govern for good and relevantly govern?
Yeah, one of the other big indicators with respect to power responsibility and infrastructure being private has been the example you mentioned earlier, the Ukraine war. In an article published last year, the Carnegie Endowment argued that the Ukraine war is driving a redistribution of sovereign authority, as militaries rely on privately owned digital infrastructure and data systems that sit outside direct state control. They spotlight Starlink as the clearest example for civilian and military comms. And Ukraine remains beholden to a single decision maker who could and has threatened to switch the service off in Elon Musk. And it also shows how even civilian tools become warfighting scaffolding. Telegram evolved from a messaging app into battlefield information infrastructure for coordination, propaganda, and intelligence sharing. So, Sue, what are your thoughts on this assertion of a redistribution of sovereign authority, principally where one billionaire and soon to be trillionaire, I believe, can enable or disable a nation's communications or critical infrastructure?
Well, it's happening, as you articulate. And there are some great things about it. Look at what Starlink did for Ukraine, because a single decision maker could decide to provide a capability that was really good in a operationally relevant time frame. Pretty hard to argue with that. And right up until that moment, he said, I might turn it off. And the answer is now that's on his personal view rather than the aggregate view of either the will of the nation. One of my frustrations with Congress being so irrelevant right now is they are the voice of the people. I know sometimes members of Congress act like they're somehow royalty, but the truth is they are what representative republics use to express view. What I will offer is that we have seen this moment already play out. The 5G precedent taught the system that this ability for private companies to make decisions that seem perfectly reasonable to them can actually create something that's awfully difficult. And the precedent was private firms got out of 5G hardware on really rational commercial grounds. There were low margins, they were high revenue, but low profit, long payback periods, and really capital intensive. So they said, you know what, we're gonna outsource them. And so the US stepped out of the communications infrastructure because it was not important to them, and they knew that it could exist differently. The problem is what looked like a business choice actually turned into be a security choice, where China decided that for its interests and its advances, it was going to step into that market. And for all intents and purposes, the 5G market at the base communications level is controlled by a foreign power whose interests are very different from ours. You can't argue with the business decision the companies made, but you can now realize that they made a security decision and they were not well positioned to understand that as well. So I think what your example shows is that these companies, heck, they're bigger than some countries. They do enable good outcome, but they tend to provide something immediate. And the country in this case, and whether that is Ukraine if Starlink had been turned off, or the US in the case of 5G, is bearing the consequence of that choice when it didn't have a voice in that choice when it was made. So I think that's what the question is. And maybe that's why I like what South Korea is doing. It's saying, no, we're going to put both considerations up front into decisions, and we're going to have a framework that allows you to do that. So I don't know that we can get out of it, but I do think it is instructive to recognize that the people that are enabling that are governed by a set of responsibilities that are one-sided and not the same as national decision makers.
Now let's move on to the geopolitics more explicitly and the quiet redistribution of sovereignty. So in this section, we've got Starlink, which we talked about a little bit already, in Iran. Iran's government disconnected 90 million people from the internet to quell their nationwide protests Iran's parliament formally banned Starlink after the June 2025 12-day war with Israel. And President Trump asked Elon Musk to help. Well, SpaceX activated free Starlink access for Iranian users, waiving the subscription fees. There's the same thing they did in Venezuela. After military action, Starlink offered a month of free broadband to connect some of the Venezuelans. So what do you think about this example specifically in Iran?
Boy, I'm so torn, Eric. Starlink is Musk's asset, and so he can do with it as he will. That's just where we are. It's just a perfect example that President Trump and Elon Musk are in cahoots. On the one hand, I love it because it's advancing free and open societies, making it freely available to allow the people of Iran to get information and communicate in the way they want to. And that's a very democratic value. In this particular instance, the fact that it is an American company. And it's one of the reasons why I love U.S. technological leadership, because I prefer our brand of how technology is used over other people's brand. So I like that too. Here's my one concern. What happens if our own administration decides that it doesn't want our citizens to have access communications? Let's say something happens. Administration independent. How do we feel about it then? And where does it intersect with foreign diplomacy and policy? How is it being used? How is our decision to allow it? Is it part of our campaign to give the Iranian rebels an opportunity to see what an off-ramp for them looks like, thereby inspiring them to take control of their own destiny? Yay, love that. What if it goes the other way? What if an American company decides it wants to support something that is not in the interest of U.S. foreign policy? Do they get to do it anyway? Well, of course, in our system they can. Is that right, given the power they have and we don't have an alternative? I don't know. So I think it's a great instructive case. In this one, and in Venezuela, I like it. But leaving it to personal relationship and private ownership as an instrument of policy and national security, boy, that feels like I can imagine a circumstance where the exact same things that we laud today would be things that we would excoriate tomorrow. If it were a pure commercial play, maybe I'm okay with that. When it starts being used as an instrument of foreign policy, in this case, it happens to be ours, so yay. Is that the only control we want?
Yeah, and you don't even have to look at a potential domestic example. You could say if he turned off access in Greenland
Perfect.
or versus Denmark, or you had Cambodia and Thailand, picking one regional actor over the other.
Or
right?
turned off every European, every NATO member until they agreed to sell. Great example. Right. So again, it's all fun and games if it's pure or if it's aligned. But when it lies outside of our governance models, how does the power of the United States, which rests in its people, come to play?
Well, what are some of the things you want folks to take away from this episode or remember?
I think the first is that technology doesn't have a soul. It just is. It by itself is not making the decisions, but the system that produces it, delivers it, makes it available, and incentivizes it does produce a certain set of things. And so while the technology itself isn't bad, I love technology, it is the humans that are generally making decisions, and this disconnect between policy and technology is really problematic. Technology, that's a hard genie to keep in the bottle. So thinking that you're going to stop it at the technology level isn't going to work. Second is power doesn't automatically carry responsibility. Responsibility has to be insisted on early, clearly, and without apology. I think that's a little bit what South Korea is trying to do. It's what we've done in the past. It's what we're dabbling at now. I mean, you and I have talked about the US AI policy. There are stirrings, but it's confusing. It's almost voluntary, and its adoption is too slow. And some of the approaches to it seems to be based more on preference than kind of ubiquity. So power does not automatically carry responsibility. You have to insist on it. And the system is telling us what it is designed to do. And our job is to decide whether that's acceptable. In other words, boy, our innovation engine, particularly in digital technologies, is saying we're going to churn this stuff out and we're going to advance it and it's going to get more capable and we're going to figure it out and we're going to figure out how to link data and we're going to have to figure out how to link data to machines and we're going to figure out how to have decisions happen outside of it. It's doing that. We have to decide whether the way it's doing it is acceptable to us and then put in something meaningful. I guess I'm going to add a fourth one, and that is, I think this tension between the responsibility that government feels and the responsibility that the private sector feels is a good tension to have. It feels like right now the government wants to stay fixed in its approach and demand gently, casually, that the private sector carry all the weight of that responsibility. I think there is some pressure on government to be more modernly relevant into how it affects our ideals. It's like we need to redesign our democracy as well.
What else are you watching?
Let's see. I think I'm watching the budget, not just how they navigate this recent DHS tension. Is it going to end up that it was just rhetoric saying, yeah, we're responding to what's happening and we're going to put real teeth behind making sure that changes are made? Or is it just going to go as things have been going? I'm in power, so I can insist on that's true. So I'm watching the budget on that, but not just DHS. I'm also watching healthcare. Aren't we on a clock with healthcare too?
I was going to say the last one was ACAs, right? They agreed to reopen the government to have a future vote on ACAs, and then nothing came of it.
I'm watching that. I'm watching one more thing, and we'll talk about this next week. We just let a cyber information sharing statute lapse. And we made the world less safe because we could not reauthorize that. So we'll talk about that more. So I'm watching that. And then Georgia, this election thing, if it turns out to be a distraction and just a bunch of assertions, that's one thing. But again, to our episode on elections, once the trust in that infrastructure is broken, how do you get it back? And this feels like a purposeful attempt to call into question that trust. So we ought to watch that. Those 2, 3, 4.
For sure.
I can't do 2.
For me, still watching Iran. We talked about the Starlink just briefly, and then also all those ships and assets being put in the Gulf. So we'll see what comes with the protests. Iran's reiterated their rhetoric of if you do anything, it'll start regional conflict, but we'll see. And then also Cuba. So there are reports that they only have about 15 to 20 days of oil left at their current burn rates. They were reliant pretty heavily on Venezuelan oil. And so this is driving worsening power outages, deepening an already severe economic squeeze. Secretary Rubio spoke last week at the hearing about we would love to see regime change in Cuba. And I think it's worth watching, especially as the squeeze starts to go on.
Yeah, those are 2 great pulls. Again, what's going on in Iran right now feels a lot like 2019, where there are a lot of forces that feel like they're sucking us into an ill-conceived conflict. So I'm hoping we can use all the tools of statescraft to keep Iran's threat from happening. And then love it on Cuba and what are the limits of us using our incredible power to insist on outcomes, and then what will be the staying power of any outcome we achieve that way. Love those pulls.
We'll see.
I think you win the what should we watch. Those were both great, Eric.
Well, only because you took my first 2.
That's the way I roll.
Yeah. That's what we're watching and how we see it. Thank you for joining us. No doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
We're so excited to be with you for a second year. We would love to hear what you think, both of our direction and our focus. It's a conversation we want even more than your adulation. So join us next week and each week for the Understandable Insights podcast, wherever you listen. And as always, go forth, do good, and for goodness sakes, be kind to one another.